Cy Hersh inhabited a very rarefied atmosphere where he called Abe, well, Abe. Unlike the rest of us, who simply tried very hard to interact with him, not at all, if we could possibly help it. That was, dare I say it, 40 years ago, when I was a Tyro foreign correspondent, just barely 30 years old. But I followed what he was up to then and for decades thereafter. Now, for the first time, we can get a peek under the hood to see just how those gears all worked and the magic got produced. And it's all in his masterful new book, Reporter, which we have, praise the Lord, only because he had to bail on a commitment to his publisher for a different book, apparently, on someone called Dick Cheney. Who'd ever care about him? A hunter who couldn't even shoot straight. But enough from me. Here we have the original source, the original Seymour Hersh.
I'm going to get close because I can't tell how many, I don't know how many places I've spoken to. And when I was done, people came up to me, 80% of the people there, and said, we didn't hear a word. So if you can't hear, do what you just did, scream. I must begin with a story about Abe because so many times people were here talking to me. Let's see. My favorite Abe story, I marked some pages. Here it is, here it is, here it is, here it is. Okay. So I'm doing my little boy wonder thing, I guess, in New York, in Washington. And we moved to New York in '75. My wife started medical school at NYU. And the first day of the job was right after Labor Day. She had already started classes. We had 2 kids. And you know how New York is. There was not only a garbage strike, there was this teacher strike. And so there was... And so we were just moving into a place down in the village. And so the first morning I was supposed to start after Labor Day, I had a 7-year-old and there was nothing else to do and a 5-year-old, so I took him with me. And so here comes, we take the train. My daughter's got a coloring book and my kid is 7, he's got a ball. And we take the train and we get into this is on 43rd Street. We get into about 9 o'clock when Abe shows up with Arthur, as they always did, I guess, in the morning, in the bathroom, in the afternoon, in the evening. They were always together anyway. And so that's my perception. Anyway, and so I walk in with 2 kids, and Abe says, very openly, "What's this?" And I said, you know how it is, Abe. We're just getting organized, and I'll read you what I wrote. My first day on the job, this is in New York, told me it was going to be a very idiosyncratic ride. In Washington, you're insulated. Abe would come in sometimes and give me what became a Bill Murray noogie thing and say, "How's my little commie today?" And then he would say, "What do you have for me?" He was always worried because I was clearly anti-war because I worked for McCarthy. Did speeches and was this press guy running against Johnson. And so it made no bones, I hated the war in Vietnam, which is not a political judgment. It was just an OJT. I covered it for the AP. Anyway, so I was going to be idiosyncratic ride. There were family issues. I was to report for work after Labor Day. Teachers always talking about Bob. So my wife's classes started. I took them to the paper. Okay, they were happy writing. What's this? He asked of his new man from Washington. I explained the situation and told him the children would take care of themselves while it took a day or 2 to get organized. That's fine, he said, with a perfunctory nod hello. No small talk with the kids. A few hours later, I had an office behind the sports department next to Roger Wilkins, other people. It just was a fun place to be. And by that time, my little 5-year-old was drawing in my room, the office I had, and the 7-year-old, remember Tony Konauser used to work for the Times? The 7-year-old is playing an intense, serious kickball game with the sports department because they're all 7-year-olders themselves. It was a lot of fun. He had a great day. So it was just a fun day. I look up at the door, and it's an unsmiling Abe. And Abe usually called me Cy. "Seymour," he said. I tell you, this is verbatim. What do you think would have happened if on that fateful day 2,000 years ago, Mrs. Moses had told her husband that he had to stay home and take care of the kids? Do you think the waters would have parted? This is a guy totally on the side of women reporters, no question of that. Wow. I just said, I thought he was kidding, but he wasn't. Frown. And I said, I don't know, Abe. I'll read you a couple footnotes because the thing about, I always say I was there in the halcyon days. The Times had money. I joined the paper in 72 in May, and I was at the New Yorker, actually. I remember asking Mr. Shawn, William Shawn, who hired me. I was tainted for the Times and Post earlier. I tried for a job after doing My Lai and winning, all those prizes and stuff like that, and doing a book with a wonderful editor, Bob Loomis, at Random House. And the fact that I'd worked for a political guy running for president, Gene McCarthy, tainted me. And so I was a little worried about that, even though the Times magazine was always asking me to write stories for them, but not the paper. So I got a job at the New Yorker, and I was happy doing it. I will tell you, the first story, just how different it was. I'd been a AP reporter, worked for UPI, worked as a police reporter in Chicago. The first time I did a piece for him, I had a project that I was on that he hired me for. But I ran into a story, and it ran to be 12,000 words. And I remember calling him up, a very slight, but with intense sort of command presence. He didn't blink when he looked at you. It was very strong. Anyway, I called him up and I said, Mr. Shawn, I said, I'm really sorry that piece ran so long. And he said, I kid you not, for newspaper guys, listen to this. Oh, Mr. Hersh, he said, stories are never too long or too short. They're too boring or too interesting. How's that? And on that piece, that's amazing. And when I got a proof back for the first piece I did, which ran at 12,000 words, my editor was a guy named Pat Crow, a wonderful editor, but he said, Shawn wants to read a proof. And those days it was mail. And here I had never worked for a newspaper even. I'd been a wire service guy. I'd written a book, written for magazines, but I never worked for a newspaper. And so I got a proof by mail about a week later from him. And on the third page, he circled the cliche, and he had a little small handwriting. And there wasn't much room on the galleys on the side. And he circled the cliche, and he wrote, Mr. Hersh, dash, please, PLS, please use words. I did not have to go to Columbia Journalism School, which is a good place to go, but I didn't have to go to get some lessons anyway. So part of the fun of being in those halcyon days, we're at the New York Times, and at that time, the media wasn't seen the way it is now. You're either for or against Trump. There were newspapers, the Washington Post often, and the networks. There were people taken to be objective and fair, and their reporting meant something. Now it's tune in or tune out time. It's a big loss. We can talk about that. I could talk about that all year. Even the New York Times, that still does such good work, and pays for does investigative stuff, and still tries to keep it going in a very down time. When you're doing a memoir, the first thing you realize is your memory is lousy. And I went back to a 1974 edition of the Sunday Times to look up a story. It was 574 pages, including the magazine and the book section. 500. And any story on page one, I learned the trick, is you either want to write more than 2,000 words, but if you write 1,500 words, you could get a little bit on the front page, but anything on the Sunday paper would always be one column. It was 8-column paper, 7 columns with display ads, page after page. And you have to fight to see an ad that isn't institutional. Display is gone. And so it's a different business. But at least then the Times wrote something. Even now, it came across with the Me Too issue. But when it comes to the politics, to the Trump politics, there's no middle ground now. No middle ground for somebody who, we're a crazy country, you understand. All presidential campaigns are run at 4 and 5% of the independents. So you've got Democrats and Republicans, and you've got 4 or 5% who either aren't smart or don't read or don't think enough to know what party they're in. And that's what the campaign is all about. And it's amazing, I think, that middle ground. So anyway, it was a different world. The paper was, I did fine. I was hired because it wasn't never quite said. He wanted me to go write about Vietnam from Washington. I think Abe knew that they were in trouble on the war, and he wanted me to make whoopee on it. So I did. And one of the things that bothered me was interesting. I joined in May '72, and I just wrote stories about Vietnam, none of them positive. And in December, Clifton Daniel became the bureau chief, and I was told then that they had to do Watergate because the Times had done so badly, and Abe was very chafing at Ben Bradley and the Washington Post getting the kind of success that he wanted all the time. And the thing was, I had no trouble writing for the Times about Watergate. I'd asked Sean before I left, because Sean, I was on his staff, and he was writing. I did a 25,000-word piece for him later that in '72, and he certainly wanted me to stay. And I said, Abe Rosenthal wants me to come and go to Washington and write about the war. And he said, you should do it. And I remember asking, will I be okay? And he said, you'll be okay. And he was right, I was okay. But what happened is, I was asked to write about Watergate. And for the first time, it took me months to get going because what a terrifying experience. I just read about Watergate. The Times never chased Watergate because Henry Kissinger, who had enormous influence on the bureau at the time, kept on telling everybody that there was nothing to it, and it was easy to. Times always was focused at the leadership, and I got a lesson in it. Harrison Salisbury writes about it. I forgot about it until I read his memoir. By January, I found out that the White House was still paying cover-up money to the people who broke into Watergate. I can mention this crowd. You remember Watergate? You remember Vietnam too? I take it. No, go to a college and you have to explain. We had a war called Watergate, but on the other hand, I remember when I was in my 20s and 30s. World War I was, Hemingway wrote some novels about it, and Flanders Field. I mean, we didn't know, so it's okay that kids don't get it, don't know. You have to explain My Lai to kids when I give a speech. It was a bad thing that happened. Anyway, I never had more trouble getting a story in than the first story I wrote, which ran about 8,000 words in the Times. It was a 3-part series they made into one piece. And the worry about it was because I was saying that the President of the United States was involved in covering up a break-in. And the worry about that institutional, and so in a funny way, the story about I've got 3 long chapters on the Times because I had so much fun and angst there. It was a cultural change because they had a president that was clearly not able to carry the day. We controlled the agenda for 2 years in Watergate. We in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Washington Star, the LA Times, we were the arbiters of truth. It doesn't exist anymore, but it was an amazing time. And there also was a difference in how we treated the bad guys. We knew Mitchell, and I didn't know Haldeman. I knew Ehrlichman. I got to know him. We knew Bud Crow one of the plumbers. I didn't know the other guy who worked with him on the plumbers, David Young. He went to Europe right away, and didn't get into it. You knew him. And so I have to tell you a footnote I wrote that says a lot about it was just a different period. And I'm writing about, at one time, Mitchell was the Attorney General, who was just a bond dealer, and he happened to be in the same law firm with Nixon, and Nixon made him Attorney General. It was never a worse fit. Remember Martha Mitchell? He stood by her all the time. Although he did say one good thing about being in jail, he didn't have to have breakfast with her every morning. But but that was said privately. Publicly, he supported her. So I have a footnote. That's my favorite. Some guy reviewed my book and said, just read the footnotes and forget the book, he said. Anyway, so I knew Mitchell slightly, having interviewed him a few times. This is during the height of Watergate. He used to scream at me, you're going to go to jail, or you're going to put your ass in a sling, stuff like that. But there was something about it that was very likable. So having interviewed him a few times and was surprised when he showed up with two of his lawyers for a late lunch in downtown Washington in same time he was on trial. He was on trial in that morning and went back that afternoon. He was on trial for perjury, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. He ended up doing 9 months, I think, at least that much. So I nodded when he came in because we had our exchanges, but left the group alone until the end of his meal. The lawyers, and by the way, we knew the lawyers, and we would talk to the lawyers. Now, if you talk to the Ty Cobb, I think, some reporter talked to him, and he said something impolitic. He immediately does a tweet, and there's a blog. He files it for the paper. The MSNBC and CNN do a chyron, what's it called? Breaking news, lawyer says this, and he's on 5 shows that night. It's the front page of all the papers. In those days, we just sort of, you shot your mouth off, so what? We let it go. Bigger fish to fry. It wasn't this rat-tat-tat-tat. Things are changing now because of the border. But before this border stuff, I'm telling you, this orange man was winning. He was winning the war of tweets. But I think too many people forget, he ran against 13 guys with roughly 300 years of political experience, ate them up, destroyed a dynasty, the Bush dynasty, took Hillary down, destroyed the Clinton dynasty. And you can write him off all you want as this gaping moron, but I'm afraid, I think now he's burned it. He's either going to quit this quickly or he's going to hang up. I have no use for the guy. I just think he's more dangerous in the next the next election cycle than you think he is. I'm talking about the next presidential cycle. Anyway, so Mitchell, back to Mitchell. The lawyers had departed. Mitchell and I waited till they left, and I went and I sat down at his table. And I going, John, and he was signing the bill. Lawyers always pay, right? He was signing the American Express card, and he tore off, he said, went like this, and he tore off the receipt and asked me for a pen and tore something on the back of it. No, I had a pen. Maybe I'd given him the pen earlier when he got the bill. And he wrote something in the back and folded it, and he said to me, and I remember, I wrote this down at the time just for myself. He gave me the note. He said, "This will tell you all you need to know in life, kiddo," he said, and asked if I would, he said, "Wait till I leave." So I did wait until they left the restaurant before looking at it, and the note said, "Next time, take the 5th. Instead of saying, "I'm not talking," he started talking, and he ended up in the Hooskow for that. I just love that story. Maybe you don't like it as much as I do, but I like it. So one more story about a footnote, about how you can be so dumb. And this is a sort of, wow. Give me one of those. Anyway, no, I'm okay. This is about a world that still exists. It's a world of America being up to his ears in bloody stuff. Today, yesterday, maybe, post-war, maybe there was a real justification. Russians were into it much more, but now. So I wrote a series of articles for the New York Times. I was out of the Times. I had this wonderful relationship with Abe, which is when I left the paper, and it is so, 3 places, even at the New Yorker and 3 at the AP and with the New York Times. It's my belief that editors get tired of people like me who walk into their office with a dead rat full of lice and dump it on the desk and say, "I want to do this dead rat story. It's going to cost you a lot of money. I may not get it. I may spend 5 months on it. And then when I do get it, you're going to get sued. You're going to have 5 law firms talking to you. You're going to lose customers, and nobody's going to like it." They do get tired of that, turns out. So anyway, so when I left the paper in 79, I wrote until Abe left in 86. I had it wrong in the book. Somebody told me. I had it later. But I did change it, John. I did change it. Right? But even after he left, when Max was still there, Franco, I was writing stuff for the paper. So in 82, I did a series. I did a long 2-part piece for the magazine on 2 guys that were selling arms to Gaddafi, a guy named Ed Wilson and a guy named Turple. Wilson was an ex-CIA guy, and Turple was an asset. Wilson was a player. Okay, so I did this series, and after it's published, and I get contacted by another guy that said he was an operative. He'd worked off the books for the CIA, and he said, the one thing you're missing is me. I know that the people that, the story was about ex-CIA guys selling arms under the table to Gaddafi. This man calls me, gives me his name, we meet, and he says there were also nuclear arms, nuclear materials for weapons going there. And I was in the middle of my book on Kissinger. I did 4 years to do a book on Kissinger. And the net impact was it did not diminish. It came out in '83, and it was a bill of attainder, if you will. I just happen to believe he lies like most people think. And anyway, and yet the next year, every magazine and newspaper in America was trying to get Kissinger at their table at the annual dinner of the Washington Press Corps. So I didn't do any damage to him in the long run. Anyway, so I was in the middle of the book, and I didn't want to follow up on this. And one of the guys who helped me a lot on Kissinger, and his information had been accurate, was a conservative guy named Richard Allen. And Dick Allen was then the National Security Advisor in the White House for Ronald Reagan. And so and Allen, I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to do more on this. I had to get back to my book. So I thought, okay, I'm going to do something I never do. I'm going to go talk to the government, or at least pass word. So I called Dick up, and he said, I gave him the name of the guy. I didn't have a serial number. I just gave him the name and some place he'd been. And I said, if he's real, he claims he's got something you guys ought to know. And, good luck. He called back and he said, the guy's real, bring him in. I said, I'm not bringing him in. He said, no, come. We're laying on a meeting even now. We're laying on with all the brass in the Situation Room. And I'd never been to the Situation Room, and I was a freelance writer. If I'd been at the Times, I would have asked an editor if it's okay. Probably would have gotten it okay. So I go to the meeting in the sit room. You got to do clearance. It's a series of offices. Reporters have been there since, but at that time it was a very mysterious, powerful place in the basement of the White House. And so one part of me, when Alan invited me, he said, it's none of my business. On the other hand, I'd never seen it, so I go to the meeting. It was agreed my presence would be off the record. Another mistake. At one point during the meeting, I'm only going to describe it in this way, a senior official told my operative in front of me that I understood there was nothing he had not done for his country. The idiot I brought to the meeting said yes, and added there were many times he had done the absolute nothing for the country. And it was clear to all that the two were talking about sanctions assassinations. I'm talking about in the middle of the White House. I was appalled and angered by the exchange and the fact that it took place in front of me. I was now a participant and not a reporter. Things were said that I could not and did not write about. I walked the block after the meeting towards my office with the operative and just turned on him, was so pissed off at him. I said, how can you bring up that kind of stuff? And then he said to me, you want a copy of it? You want the transcript? And I said, what are you talking about? We've been searched and patted. He'd snuck it in a crevice. He snuck in a tape recorder, and he had a tape of it. So I then had the problem. It was just amazing. I told him to get the hell away from me. I got away from him, called Alan and said he had been betrayed. Alan said not to worry, and we maintained a friendship, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. From that point on, I have no idea what happened to this information, couldn't care less. Off the record was anathema to me. And I learned once again never to allow myself to become a participant in government functions. I was just asked in the last 2 days by somebody here in New York if I would talk to a very senior person about something they were investigating, and I said, I don't do that. My guy was mad at me. I said, don't do that. I don't use feed of information. I'd much rather sneak. And what I've learned in my career, and we'll do questions because you have better questions than probably any group would. All of you are so old-timers. I learned that what you do is you look for those people in the military, in the intelligence agency. I didn't turn off my phone. It's all your fault, not mine. Anyway, I learned that what you want to find are those guys who take the oath. The oath is to the Constitution. And you want to find those guys, even in the CIA, and they do exist, who don't take an oath of office to their boss, to the president, but to a general or an admiral, but to the Constitution. And those are the people I look for. And those are the people that I do attract. And so all is not lost. There are some of those right now in this government, believe it or not. And I think journalism may want to look at this whole experience when it's over and try and figure out how we ended up with Trump is catnip for ratings, particularly for the cable shows. He's catnip for the New York Times, which has more online subscribers than ever before. And the number they want to get to, I just learned, is quite high, and they probably will, because, the more bad news about Trump you get. And so we're polarizing. The whole notion of journalism is being polarized in either you're for or against the guy. And there's something wrong with that. There's something really profoundly wrong with that. And how it'll play it, I don't know. There's no... The people who like Trump absolutely will not believe anything in the New York Times or the Washington Post or MSNBC or CNN, and the vice versa. That didn't exist, and I'm not sure it's a good idea. So let's do questions. I'm not running away anywhere. How are we going to do it? Yes. Go ahead. Oh, you got to get a mic. Wow, you guys are really sort of progressive. All right.
Alan, be quiet so you get the mic. Thank you, Myron.
Wait, is it on?
Yes, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear him?
So the question is, how are you dealing with the destruction, disappearance, and non-compilation of data that the Trump administration is engaging in widespread throughout the government?
I never was a big, the stuff I'm looking for doesn't get destroyed necessarily, the secret junk. But I will tell you that one of the issues I have is focusing so much on his tweeting and all that stuff. And I don't know much about it because my children absolutely have forbidden me to tweet or retweets because it's some really nasty stuff out there. What I would have done had I been ruler of the world, you have no idea what some of the decisions that are being made about basic things like safety, environment down the line. And you focus on the guy running Pruitt, this guy who thinks, like unfortunately a lot of people in public life, that there's nothing wrong with spending $43,000 for a phone booth or whatever it is. But some of the thing that's going on down the line, I was at a journalism conference, the investigative reporters and editors, and here's something interesting. IRE has been a group that's been viable for about 40 years. And now we're in a downtime. The convention they had in Orlando last week had almost 1,800 participants, the third largest in their history. And they started in the days when everybody was flush. So young people are going into journalism, wanting to do investigative work, going beyond the surface at a level that's quite amazing, given the fact that there's no chance of real financial reward. It's a very tough business. So there's something good going on. Maybe Trump's inspiring that in a way. You want to go report. So here's some of the things I'm hearing that you should be hearing about. They're dropping safety requirements for things like, among other things, baby cribs. So that the requirements were so that a baby couldn't push and fall out. Now they're lowering them because corporations want it. I mean, you can find 100 examples like this. And so we focus so much at the top on the personalities. I would have gone and just seen how it hits in various compacts if I were the ruler of the world. And I would have avoided getting into a tit-for-tat on tweets with Trump. Because until just the last few weeks, he was going up. He went up 8 points. He's now losing because of the madness down in Mexico. And You do know it started 2 months ago. You're only hearing about it because suddenly somebody got a tape recording, but it started 2 months ago. Where was the press on this? There was some, but it never became an issue. And if you're waiting for the Democratic Party to lead the way, forget it. They're not doing it. So here you have a guy running for president. Again, he's going to run. And you got a Democratic Party that hasn't figured out yet what to do, except to do what Hillary did, which is to run against them personally and lose. And I'm here to tell you, you can want to believe the Russians did it all you want, but that's not a case they've made yet. They talk about it. They keep on saying they have high confidence. But I learned a long time ago, high confidence. The last time I ran into it, we were told again and again in the Bush-Cheney days, after 9/11, we were told that they had high confidence that Saddam Hussein indeed had WMD. That was high confidence. High confidence means we don't know. And we're going to tell the boss, we're going to give it to the boss the way they want it. I have a memo in here, one to Rumsfeld. It wasn't relevant to my book in a way, but it was. It's a report done by an officer who never got another promotion, an intelligence officer. That was his last promotion, on WMD in 2002, when they were fighting the public fight to get support for going to do the bombing, to attack, to go attack Iraq. We all know the history of that stupidity. We were then in the middle of a stupidity, we were all fighting an all-out war against an idea, war on terror. Who were we fighting? Anyway, we can get into that. That's another story. But the memo was, it's a fall 2002. He asked a very bright guy who was a two-star general in intelligence, give me a straight report. And the report comes in, it's one of those things, what do you call it when you put something on a board and you flash it? PowerPoint. And the first sentence says, well, we assess with high confidence they're doing, the first sentence says, I got to read it. It says my editor, John Siegel, sitting there over there. I mean, I don't know why he's still editing me. We're done, but he's still editing me. Okay, it's forever. It says, status of WMD programs. This is dated 9 September 02. It was publicly released. That is, was released. I only learned about it from somebody in the Signet world, NSA world. And he told me, you haven't seen this, he said. I can send it to you because they've released it, but they haven't put it anywhere. Status of WMD programs, Iraq. And I'll just read the first page. 1, we assess Iraq is making significant progress in WMD programs. That's the tell sentence. That's the high confidence. 2nd, our assessments rely heavily on analytical assumptions and judgments rather than hard evidence. 3rd sentence, the evidentiary base is particularly sparse for Iraqi nuclear programs. Next sentence, concerted Iraqi CDD and D, they mean camouflage, concealment, denial, et cetera, as effectively negated our view in the large part of the WMD program. And then there's a box, and in italics it says, we don't know with any precision how much we don't know. So that's what high confidence means. So there you are. So just, yes.
Yes, it is. All right. So,
loud.
Can you hear me all right?
I hear you, but
thank you very
that's
much.
not
Can
important.
you hear me over there? All right.
Can you hear him?
Can you?
All right.
All right.
They can't hear me ask that question, but that's okay.
I'll go over to them afterwards. Anyway, Cy, I know I'm familiar with your Orlando conference. You'd be surprised how many journalists and media people are down where I spend some of my time in Sarasota, Florida. The question I have for you is, how do we bridge the disconnect between a younger generation, number one, we're preaching to the choir here. We understand what you're saying. And number two, the disconnect between those people in the flyover states that just listen to and believe a Donald Trump. I haven't got the answer to that. I've asked this at any number of luncheons. How do you bridge? Do you have any thoughts? Disconnect between.
If I was on a panel at CNN or MSNBC and I was asked that question, I'd begin with the two most lethal words in the world, I think. The answer, of course, is how in the hell do I know? which nobody ever says and they always say what they think because they don't know anything. I will tell you, he's even getting a surprising amount of support for the immigration stuff from those flyover. I keep on thinking of the movie Little Mary Sunshine. Remember that one about? It was a fantastic movie about 9 years ago about a 5 and 6 year old beauty pageant, and there's that world that we look at like, wow. But that's the world that exists. So the question you have to ask yourself is, are we going to end up in a civil war of sorts between us and the South and the Southwest, who are different than we are in terms of thoughts, where he's very popular? What's going to happen? This is long before Trump. This Little Mary Sunshine was really, I think, in a way, a profound movie because he was making a point that wasn't direct. He was talking about another world. It was another world, and they mocked it. Remember, she did a striptease, the little girl. That was her act. So he was mocking the other world. But that other world's out there. There are people who absolutely buy into it, and when I say he took down 13 politicians, because there's a lot of people in that world that don't trust a politician, don't want to hear him anymore. And this guy seems to be talking straight. So we're confronted with something pretty deadly. And I don't know, it says something that Hillary wasn't able to beat him. And it also says something, she spent the last 2 months calling people, what was it, irredeemable? It was some other word. Deplorables. I just did politics for 4 months with Eugene McCarthy. I was going nuts. I'd left the AP when I was writing critically about the war for the AP. I made friends with I.F. Stone that way, but the guy that ran it was going nuts because McNamara was calling him. I will say this, I got McNamara figured out as a psychotic liar about 2 months after being in that building. He was lying about aircraft deployment. I mean, just some story I worked on. I realized so hold on. There's no answer to that right now. The way we're going, it's more polarized than ever. So we're not, there's always going to be people in Chicago that read the New York Times or the Washington Post and look online, but you're losing them. The disconnect is huge. And these are not, these are the people that work in the factories. They're farmers in Iowa that are going to be adversely affected by some of the tariffs he's putting on that may still vote for him. How do you not think about it when you lose Iowa by 8 points and Ohio by 10? What is that telling you for the Democratic Party? And my guess is, if you want my dark thought on it, I was mad at hell at Obama. He let her have the party. Hillary had the party and she bankrupted it. We all know from Donna Brazile, but even some of us knew before. She ran the party and she was diverting money to her campaign that should have been done for local elections. As you know, in the Obama year, what'd you lose? Over 1,000 offices. I think it's even more, some number. The Democratic Party is not up to snuff. And one thing that's going on, there's a tremendous number, for example, women now running for congressional and local offices, and that's amazing. The women in general are pretty amazing people. I have a son that works for Vice News, so I watch Vice News, and they have a completely different, anybody under 40 knows Vice News is pretty interesting and different than the networks. They're dealing with some of these, they do running stories on some of these women running. And to a point where you get to know who they are and what they are. And so there is some hope, but it's not gotten to the leadership. But, things come from below. It's going to have to change. The Democratic Party is not going to be able to beat this guy unless something happens. Now, he's falling on his face. But all he has to do is figure it out and reverse it. And he will.
So your answer hang on. Cy, all the way to
No,
your
my
left.
answer is the same as yours. How in the hell do I know?
All the way to your left.
Go ahead. Yes, somebody way back there.
Cy, you have found yourself not too long ago in the midst of a media firestorm yourself.
Oh, you bet.
And I wanted you to talk about that from your perspective, being in the media bullseye, in fact, as one of the people who's most admired in journalism.
Which one? I mean, I did a Kennedy book. Let me just say this. I did a Kennedy book that caused me more grief I did it way too early for the Camelot lovers. I mean, now we accept that Jack, and I'll tell you how it was a book basically. I did a story for the New York Times. You want to talk about, I make fun of Abe, but in this book, one of the things I got was a history of the Watergate period that the CIA did that was declassified. And I did a book on domestic spying. That I did a story for the Times in December 22nd, 1974, about the CIA spying on Americans that led to the church hearings, which was the first time the Senate and the Congress really looked at the CIA, and out of it came the first two oversights committee on intelligence. It's all been wiped out now by the internecine warfare that's going on. It's all ruined. There's no more Democrats in the intelligence committees out there, and Republicans want to kill each other. It's all gone. Oversight's gone. That's a big loss, but nobody's looking at it that way. I am. And so what happened is, and in this CIA report, I had learned something bad had gone on in the CIA in early 1972. I knew there was some internal stuff that was driving them all crazy. I didn't know what it was. And I began asking questions just as I was going along, working for the New York Times in Vietnam and then on Watergate. I kept on nagging about this other story. It turns out that they were copying me and watching me, and every time I called people, they would call it in. They were watching me since early 72, for 2 years before I wrote the story. And before I told anybody in the Times about the story. And to show you what it can be when it's good, and I tell stories lists about Abe, but I can tell you a million more about Abe, because, he was idiosyncratic, as I say, as was Gene McCarthy, so it's sort of interesting. Anyway, people that are high IQ, as I may be anyway, maybe not just idiosyncratic, more than smart, but anyway. So what happens is, I'm doing Kennedy, and I knew from the church committee, and I knew there was much more than they made public about Kennedy's desire, Jack and Bobby, to kill Castro. And the motive was, if you remember, the Bay of Pigs took place and Castro survived. And the Kennedys are really tough pals, and they believed in payback. So meanwhile, I start looking into Kennedy, and before long, I get a FedEx package this big from one of the senators on the committee, full of stuff they didn't publish. And it leads me into assassination stuff, something called ZR rifle. And it turns out ZR turns out to be a designator much broader than just Castro. Anyway, leads me into this stuff. And so I can't figure out what the hell is he doing? Castro this, Castro to kill him. So there's an old CIA guy, he's long dead, who didn't like me at all. His name was Sam Halpern. And he lives in Virginia, and I go see Sam, and he agrees to see me. He's still irritated at me, but I'm seeing him. And I said, explain to me. He said, you don't understand. He said, how much pressure we were under Castro. You think it was just us doing it. I'm telling you, absolutely not. And I said, well, what was it about? He said, do you want to know about Jack Kennedy? Go find his Secret Service agents. I know that sounds like something crazy, but I did. I found 4 guys who covered Kennedy, and they loved him and also were terrified by him, because it was one hottie a day, two a day on trips. When they went on trips, campaign speeches, the sheriff would bring in a couple of hookers, and they would alert all the press, shut up, don't see anything. And these guys talked to me about it. Their fear was that one of those off the street broads, that's what they were, would do something drastic to him. Bite when they shouldn't or whatever. And they would be before a congressional committee, and they would be saying, the Secret Service, you allowed whores to go in there knowing they were whores? And they'd say, what else could we do? So what he was saying to me was the recklessness about his sexual life was something that also took place in his political life. And they viewed in the CIA his desire to get payback was the same sort of on-the-edge way he wanted to live. So I did a chapter on that. And I named the agents. They agreed to be named even though they were written out of the party. The retired 4 agents went on the record. On the record, I went over the stuff I was going to write with them 8 times. They didn't change stuff. I still changed. One died recently. The other 3 I still talk to. We exchanged cards. I sent him a book. And so I lost that war. I sold a lot of books, but I really lost that war. I got mau-maued by the Camelot crowd. I got mau-maued a little bit by the Obama crowd, too, in some of the stories I wrote, when I suggested that Obama treated the killing of bin Laden as a lone American. He was the Lone Ranger riding up against bin Laden, who was in a prison controlled by the Pakistani intelligence service when we killed him. It was all a done deal. And I ran into a lot of trouble there, too. Of course, history, the problem is we paid a lot of money to certain generals in Pakistan. You know how you give money to a general in Pakistan? You get the Saudis to get they've toughened the rules now, just in the last 4 or 5 years on this. You get a boatload of oil headed for a port, let's say in Singapore, and halfway there you reflag it. And it goes to the big port in Karachi, next to Karachi. And then they offload it, and the generals have, $20, $30 million of oil to sell. That's how you do it. And I didn't write that, but I know how it worked. And I've talked to people, just in the last, a man named Asif Durrani, a former head of Pakistani ISA, published a book in which he alluded to it, and he and I talk about it. We all agreed, he lives in a compound, a subsidized compound in Rawalpindi next to Islamabad. It's for 4-star officers and head of the intelligence service, beautiful golf course between all the houses, etc. He doesn't want to lose it. And so there's nothing going to happen. But of course Obama used it politically. He's a black guy running for re-election. I didn't even give him that much. I don't blame him that much. He wanted to be re-elected. And of course it had to be a shootout at the OK Corral. He did order him shot. He did kill him. But it was all done with the aid of the Pakistanis. It's impossible not to have done it, but I want to get into it. But I got beat up on that. And what bothers me about Obama, as much as he elevated that office, given what we had before that, I include Bill Clinton in that, is that in the second term, he let it go too. He didn't push some things he should have pushed. He didn't make the changes. We should have got out of Afghanistan. Everybody knew it. It's a losing game. He didn't do it. He didn't push the buttons. So I have a lot of problems with him. And I think a lot of the stuff that Cheney began, about which I couldn't write the book about Cheney because I have people who are still there. They're supernumeraries. They still work in national security, and they still go to meetings even with the Orange Man. And I have to protect him. But a lot of stuff that Cheney did, we have the Watson Center at Brown University put out a paper about 2.5 months ago, about 10 weeks ago. They did a study of where we are militarily in combat around the world, 76 spots, many of them, a significant percentage, in Africa. And the Joint Special Operation Command that was, the boys that rode around in Afghanistan after 9/11, on horseback and cuffers and long beards and sandals, those guys are still there. It's a different generation. They report, many of them are zealots, political zealots. I'm not exaggerating when I say they see themselves as crusaders fighting the Muslim masses onslaught in the 14th century and 13th century. They really are strange. And murder still goes on. There's very little, you hear about what happened in Mali, and you get a report that they write and they edit. I think that's a great story to be covered. It's very hard. I think getting control of those people is a real problem. We are in 76 different places making war now, and we know very little about it. And it's almost impossible to stop it. And we have a president that doesn't read. So he's not going to know what the report says. And so I don't see the next few years as being doing anything good for. It'll be great for the newspapers. The catnip is still there. Cable TV will get more ratings. But this White House can still call up, have the press secretary call up somebody in cable news and leak a story, and 10 minutes later it's on. There's no analysis. Somebody just earlier here today who worked on NBC was saying there's no thought about it. There's no research. There's no second day story. It's just on, and it drives the agenda. It does drive the agenda, and it drives it for the good newspapers. Because
Side to your right.
what?
Question to your right.
To my right. I'm sorry. Just tell me to shut up, and I will.
This is a question that's been on my mind. I've been wanting to ask you for years. What were the Watergate burglars really looking for, and did they find it?
How the hell do I know?
It's too easy.
No. I think they were trying to destroy the Democrats once and for all. Nixon was, I think, you hear that word? That means I don't know squat. But the best guess is they thought Larry O'Brien, there was something in his files that would discourage, make it impossible for any Democrat to win the election in '72. Don't ask me why. Nixon ran scared. You've listened to Nixon on those tapes. He's Jekyll and Hyde. You know, in public life, he was very scared of re-election. He was very worried about it. He thought the anti-war stuff, and these guys. You know, there's a horrible story in my book about President Johnson and the war. You know, but arousing, disgusting stuff. They get into a war they can't get out, and they keep on thinking they're going to win. The one good thing is we used to have a show and tell where every 6 months a 2-star Army general would go and testify to Congress how the new Iraqi army is going to stand up against ISIS, or how the new Afghan army is going to stand up, and how we're training. We've got they've got now 24 combat-ready battalions. And meanwhile, every time we would take any Afghan trainees and build a facility for them, the next day all the plumbing was gone, all of it. I mean, all the hardware was gone. I mean, it's just, and so at least we don't have that spectacle. We're not claiming there's any solution in Afghan, and I just know there's some guy there in Afghanistan. We still have thousands of troops that's convinced he's going to be the last guy to get killed, and that means that it's not just a question of shooting first. He's just going to shoot. It's that we're 18 years, 17 years into a war we never should have started in the first place. The Taliban had nothing to do with 9/11. Bin Laden did, and I assure you, the Taliban told us he's not our guest. Take him out. I wish I could say who. A former high-level CIA man who ran. You know, the Taliban worked with us, some of them, in a previous incarnation against the Russians. Jimmy Carter and Brzezinski thought we can make the Russians have a Vietnam War. Their loss in Vietnam, and we attacked the government. By the way, one of the best governments there was one the Russians put up. The other ones were all puppets. But nobody cares about such stuff. My guess is, the smart guess is, and it's not just mine, most people think they were looking for something that would help them. They thought O'Brien had something about money, dirty under-table money. There was a lot of money going to Nixon. You know, I worked with Gene McCarthy. He ran for president. Mary McGrory, who some of you know, wonderful columnist, she lived across the street. In 68, I was 67, I was... The way the AP got rid of me is they reassigned me from the Pentagon to Health and Human Services, and I got the hint. I was always in trouble with Arthur Sylvester was the press secretary, and I would file these stories. We're going to get you for this. And they call up the general. Anyway, didn't matter. So I leave, and I'm freelancing. And by late 67, Bobby Kennedy isn't going to run. I've got an office in the National Press Building next to Ralph Nader. And I start my story on My Lai here. When I first got my My Lai tip by saying, this was a period when I used to sometimes have lunch with Ralph Nader downstairs. There was a little cafe in the National Press Building. And I used to go for lunch with Ralph, and I'd order my tuna fish, and Ralph would reach over. He always ordered swordfish because it swam at the deepest part of the ocean. Little did he know that mercury was there too, but that's okay. But we didn't know that then. Ralph would take, I kid you not, Ralph, this is how I began the section on My Lai. Funny way to begin it, but that's where I was. He would take a piece of my tuna fish, spread it out, and say, that's paper, that's rat shit, that's so-and-so. Really fun. It was a real upper. Anyway, so I'm desperate because I knew from covering the Pentagon from honest officers, and I also had read. I read the various church groups that been putting out very critical reports about the war in 65 and 66. And believe it or not, the Russell Tribunal, which everybody in America thought, oh my God, Bertrand Russell, he had this anti-war, anti-American. He had a section in which a bunch of American kids who were there in 65 and 66 testified. You could find them. They went back to their hometown. And they talked about this. As early as March of 65, when we first began to get operational, and by the way, I know the Orange Man lies, But he lies about something he said to you 5 minutes earlier. Johnson told the American people in '65, for 6 months, we're not going to war there when he was putting troops in. That's what I call a major league lie. But that doesn't diminish what the old man does. It just shows what a lying, incredibly corrupt person he was on the war, despite the other stuff he did on civil rights. I can't look away. Anyway, the point of all this is that, I don't know, it doesn't matter. I could go on forever about the war. Let's just do more questions.
One more question?
Yeah, because it's now 4 o'clock. And I got to be somewhere else.
Not quite. Couple minutes.
4:30. 4:40.
Couple minutes. All right. Look, you're a great reporter. You have great sources, and you still have those great sources. And I don't want you to say, how the hell should I know the answer to this? But the question is, given the media landscape, which we know is strange and changing, given Trump, who he is, can democracy survive this?
All right, suppose, I'll give you the side, he is president. You got to remember, he's president. We've had a lot of bad presidents and we've survived. I would argue that Johnson, in continuing the war, when he knew, we now know he was pretty sure he couldn't win it. And, the amount of boys he killed. And that's secondary to re-election. I mean, he was always, so we've had bad presidents before. I'll give you, things are changing now because of the thing in the border. And, if it only took legs because somebody got a tape recording, I'm telling you. The slowness of the mainstream media to get on this is unbelievable. My wife, a month ago, gave a lot of money to some group that was trying to do something about it. It's just there. Anyway. He did it. He did do it today. I said the only way he can save himself is to do that. I was saying that earlier. He had to do it. But let me tell you a couple of things. He doesn't read, okay? He's in his second year as presidency. He's a child. He does not read even intelligence. This woman, the torture woman, happens to be, among other things, everybody knew about torture in 2001 and 2002. I wrote a piece in the New Yorker about something called the American Taliban, who was shot twice, and an 18-year-old kid who went and joined the Taliban when his parents divorced. Most kids just, do dope and get laid, but this guy studied, I don't know what he did. He studied Arabic and went to the Middle East. That's nuts. Anyway. He was not the army, the military, and they prosecute him. He's got a year and a half left of a 20-year. They never, in no place did the American government ever claim he was in any way a fighter. There's no evidence he ever had a gun in war. He never was a fighter. I'm just telling you what's in the court record. So he was tortured. He was left out to be tortured. They had 2 bullets in him they didn't treat. I remember writing about it in the New Yorker. Nobody cared. We were happy. And that was the attitude. So we got somebody. This woman, the only thing I know about her is you heard her testimony. She's articulate, and if Trump read, he'd be pretty mad at some of the stuff she writes. But having said that, let me give you an example where I think the press screws up about Trump. You can attack him for going to the Korean. And does he know about nuclear policy? Are you kidding? Ronald Reagan didn't even know what the nuclear triad is, air, war, and sea. He didn't know it. He didn't know you can drop bombs by 3-way. He knew nothing. So forget that presidents. They're not expected to know something. What he did have was he got a briefing before he went. He may be a child, but there's a lot of smart people around. The CIA does psychological profiles, and they have a coterie of psychoanalysts, doctors, many in private practice that do work, and it's really beautiful. I've only seen a few. There's one on Putin that's very interesting, but I can't do it. I can't talk about it. But it's very interesting. It's less dark than you think. Anyway, and the one it was all about this crazy kid, this 3rd-generation kid in North Korea. And it's a 200, I shouldn't even get into the number of pages, but it's a large study saying the way to do this guy, the thing he needs is money. He's desperate. He'll make, so he doesn't read it. The way the president translates the briefing he gets is he says to the guy, you've got beautiful beaches, you can build so many condos there, and do that. But it works. It did work. I mean, there's business to be done. So you can make fun of him, and you should, for the way he does stuff, but there's a teeny bit of something there that's a little more than you know. That's all I'm saying. So until this last thing, I was going to say, oh, he's awful. He is awful. He wants to be loved by the New York Times, believe me, as much as by Fox News. That's what he really wants. He wants the New York Times to love him. He's a guy that couldn't get into Wingfoot. They wouldn't even begin the fancy club up in Westchester County. He couldn't get into any good golf club. He's just been mistreated. He wants to be loved. And he's a 3-year-old, and he's a child. And so I know something about some meetings. I know a lot about certain kinds of meetings. And he does listen when it comes to national security stuff. He doesn't comprehend much. He screws it up. But he's got one thing he wants to do. It's not just 30,000 combat troops in South Korea, as nobody wants to talk about. There's a couple 100,000 support troops in the country. We are spending billions in a complete idiocy. There's no reason for us anything other than a liaison detachment there. There's hundreds of billions of dollars to save. And that's the way he looks at it. And I think that's going to be a model. He's not going after Bashar Assad. You know, nobody knows. The Kurds have cut a deal. It's almost over there. And we're pulling out. We're pulling out slowly. We don't make noise about it. And I think eventually he may be the first president since 2001 who may actually say we've got nothing to gain by keep on killing people in Afghanistan. We've got nothing to gain. And we can cut a deal with the Taliban tomorrow. They're mercantile. The Taliban before 9/11 were dealing with an American oil company, an Argentine Brightus. Henry Kissinger was representing one of the companies, and Alexander Haig was representing a competing country for a pipeline. Dealing with the Taliban. What I'm telling you is all factual. And in fact, there was even a congressional resolution praising, the Taliban for agreeing to work on pipelines. I'm serious, in May of 2001. So maybe a circuit breaker, if you will. I know this is heresy to say because he's everything bad there is. And we should be reporting all the bad stuff that's going on in the bureaucracy. But to think that he's not going to be viable is a big mistake. So you've got to, if you're the Democratic Party, you better start thinking about things you're going to do for people that are going to make them think you have something to say to them, instead of bitching about everything he does constantly. And I just may want to think that way, think positively. And instead of calling him irredeemable, whatever that word was, whatever it is, start going on something that's positive. Because the negative isn't going to work, I don't think. That's my personal view. And there's things he's done that are so abhorrent to me, to everybody. I'm a Cleveland Park Democrat. I mean, if I said publicly what I said here, I'd have to have my wife start the car for the next year. Bam. So, but that's what I believe. I really believe we're screwing up right now. The people that hate Trump are screwing up, and the media are screwing up, because they should focus more on the little things he's doing, the down-the-line stuff he's doing, the changes he's made down the line that we don't even report about. We're too busy reporting his tweets. And we're going one-on-one in a losing game, I think. This guy has been on public TV for 20 years. We got to go. Goodbye.
Before we thank Cy, Before we thank Cy, 2 points. First of all...
Wait.
Before we thank Cy, first of all, 2 points. First of all...
Can anybody hear me?
Can anybody hear me?
I don't know. You can do it there.
Before we thank Cy, the 2 points. First of all, Michael Bloomberg has just announced he is donating $80 million to elect Democratic candidates to Congress this fall. That's number one. Okay? And number two, I cannot think of anybody more worthy of becoming an honorary Silurian, which Cy Hersh now is.
Wow.
Thanks. There we are.
Wow. Thank you. Bye-bye.